Good morning, friends. I want to start today a little differently. Most mornings I sit here and I think about what I want to say to you. I think about the right words, the right way in. But this morning I've been sitting here for almost 40 minutes, and I still don't know where to start. So I'm just going to start with the letter. It came 3 weeks ago, handwritten, 3 pages, front and back, in the kind of careful cursive you don't see much anymore. The return address said Clearwater, Florida. The name at the bottom was simply V. Caldwell. I read it once that evening. Then I folded it back up and put it on my nightstand and didn't touch it for 2 days. Not because it wasn't important, because it was too important, because I kept getting to certain parts and having to stop. On the third morning, I sat down with my coffee, this coffee, right here, and I read it all the way through. And when I finished, I just sat for a while. Then I picked up the phone, and I called the number she'd included at the bottom of the last page. Her name is Virginia, but she told me the moment I said hello. Please, just call me Ginny. Everyone does. We talked for almost 2 hours, and I told her what I'm going to tell you now. Her story deserves to be heard, not because it's extraordinary, though it is, but because it's not as rare as it should be. So this morning, I want to tell you about Ginny Caldwell, a 67-year-old woman from Clearwater, Florida, who spent the better part of a year fighting for something most of us have never had to fight for: the right to her own life. Let me start at the beginning. Ginny and Raymond Caldwell had lived in their house on the edge of Old Tampa Bay for 31 years. It wasn't a grand house. 3 bedrooms, a screened porch that faced the water, a garden that Raymond had spent the better part of 2 decades trying to get right. He'd grown up in Ohio, flat, landlocked Ohio, and there was something about living near water that never stopped feeling like a gift to him. Even after 30 years, Ginny told me, he would sometimes just stand on that porch in the early morning, coffee in hand, and look out at the bay like he couldn't quite believe he'd ended up somewhere so quiet and so beautiful. Raymond Caldwell was a civil engineer. He'd worked for the same firm in Tampa for 38 years, retiring at 64 with a modest pension and the kind of quiet satisfaction that comes from doing something useful for a long time without making a fuss about it. He wasn't a complicated man. He liked the Tampa Bay Rays, even when they broke his heart. He kept his tools organized to a degree that Ginny said bordered on the obsessive. He made the same pot of coffee every morning, measured, precise, and always left the last cup for her. He died on a Tuesday, September. He was in the garage replacing a worn brake cable on the old bicycle he'd been meaning to fix for months. Ginny was inside making lunch. She heard nothing. When she went out to call him in, he was already gone, sitting out back against the workbench with the cable still in his hands, as if he'd simply decided to rest for a moment and never woke up. Massive cardiac event, the paramedics said. Quick, likely painless. Ginny told me she's held onto those words more times than she can count. Likely painless. She said, it's the kind of phrase that becomes a small life raft in the weeks and months that follow, when the silence in the house gets loud enough to feel like a physical thing. 34 years of marriage. Half a lifetime of shared space, shared mornings, shared language. The particular shorthand that develops between 2 people who have chosen each other long enough that the choosing becomes simply the texture of life itself. The weeks after the funeral were, by Ginny's account, exactly as hard as you would expect, and also somehow harder. Friends came and then stopped coming, the way friends do, not from cruelty, but from the honest limits of attention. The casseroles ran out. The phone got quieter. But Ginny was not a woman who fell apart easily. She had worked for 22 years as an office manager for a pediatric practice in Clearwater, retiring at 62. She knew how to run things. She knew how to read a document, balance an account, return a call. After Raymond passed, sat down with their finances. The house, valued somewhere around $890,000 in the current market, the savings account with just over $338,000, Raymond's pension that would continue in a smaller form, and she understood exactly where she stood. She was not wealthy, but she was secure. Raymond had made sure of that. She was also alone, for the first time in 34 years. And she was learning, slowly and without much choice, what that actually meant. Their daughter, Sylvia, lived about 40 minutes north in a newer development outside of Dunedin. Sylvia was 41. She'd married a man named Warren Pruitt 8 years earlier, a real estate broker, pleasant enough on the surface, the kind of man who remembered your name and your drink order and made you feel briefly like the most important person in the room. Ginny had never entirely trusted the feeling. But Sylvia loved him, and that had always been enough. After Raymond died, Sylvia came by regularly. Not every day, but enough. She brought food Ginny hadn't asked for, straightened things that didn't need straightening, and looked at her mother with an expression Ginny described to me as, "The look you give a houseplant you're not sure is going to make it." Ginny bore it with patience. Grief is strange, and people who love you don't always know how to show it. She gave Sylvia grace the way she'd always given Sylvia grace. Warren came occasionally too, helpful, attentive, always with a reason. He'd noticed the gutter on the north side looked loose. He wanted to check the water heater, the roof, the HVAC. He knew a guy. He always knew a guy. Ginny told me she appreciated it at first. She really did. There's a particular vulnerability that comes with losing the person who handled certain things. And Raymond had handled certain things. Having someone step in felt for a moment like kindness. She said the first real moment of unease came about 6 weeks after the funeral. 6 weeks. 6. Warren had stopped by on a Saturday morning, and over coffee at Ginny's kitchen table, the same table where she and Raymond had eaten breakfast for 31 years. He'd brought up the subject of financial planning, estate planning, the importance of thinking ahead. He was very smooth about it, Ginny told me. Very reasonable. He talked about simplifying things, reducing complexity, avoiding probate. He had all the right words. She'd listened. She'd nodded. She'd said she'd think about it. And then after he left, she'd stood at the kitchen sink, looking out at Raymond's garden, and she'd thought, that was a strange conversation. She hadn't acted on that thought yet. She filed it away. She would wish, later, that she'd taken it out sooner. It happened gradually. That's the thing Ginny kept coming back to, both in her letter and when we spoke on the phone. Not all at once. Not in a way that would have been easy to name. Gradually. Warren's visits became more frequent. Every week, then twice a week, always with a purpose. A leaky faucet, a concern about the electrical panel, a question about whether the property taxes had been sorted. He was never empty-handed and never empty-reasoned. There was always something that needed attending to. Something Ginny might have missed. Sylvia started calling more often too. Daily, sometimes. Always warm, always loving, always with a small edge of worry threaded through the conversation like a wire. "Mom, did you take your blood pressure medication this morning? Mom, I heard we might get some storms this week. Do you have everything you need? Mom, I was thinking, maybe we should look at getting you one of those medical alert systems, just in case." Ginny was on one blood pressure medication, managed well for 6 years. She had never had a fall. She had driven herself to every appointment, every errand, every grocery run, since Raymond died without incident. None of this seemed to matter to the architecture of concern that was slowly being built around her. She noticed it. She simply didn't know yet what to call it. The first thing she called it was love. The second thing she called it was anxiety. Sylvia's anxiety about losing her father had perhaps transferred itself into worry about losing her mother. The third thing she called it several weeks later was something she didn't have a word for yet. Something that made the back of her neck prickle when she thought about it too directly. Then Warren brought Dr. Preston Gale. He introduced him as an old colleague. A family friend, really. One of the best general practitioners in the county. Just wants to pop by and check in. Dr. Gale was a trim man in his late 50s, wire-framed glasses, a pressed button-down, a manner that was professionally warm. in the way of someone who had practiced it carefully. He sat in Ginny's living room and asked her a series of questions that she found, to put it plainly, insulting. What day of the week was it? Who was the current governor of Florida? Could she tell him 3 objects he'd named at the start of the conversation? She answered every question, correctly, calmly, with the particular patience of someone who has decided not to show that they're offended. Dr. Gale thanked her for her time. He shook her hand. He said she seemed remarkably well, with an emphasis on the word remarkably that Ginny did not miss. 2 weeks later, she learned through Sylvia, mentioned almost in passing, as if it were a minor administrative detail, that Dr. Gale had written a brief report. Mild age-related memory concerns. Recommended monitoring. Suggested consideration of additional support structures. Ginny asked to see the report. There was a pause on the phone. Sylvia said she'd have to ask Warren where he'd put it. She asked to see a medical report about herself, and her daughter said she'd have to check with her husband first. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Because Ginny did. She sat with it for 2 days. She said she kept turning it over, looking at it from different angles, trying to find the charitable interpretation. Sylvia was disorganized. Warren had filed it somewhere. It was a simple miscommunication between people who were busy and meant well. She almost convinced herself. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, she was in the kitchen when she heard Warren's voice from the back hallway. He'd come in through the side door. She'd given Sylvia a key years ago, never imagining it would be used this way, and he was on his phone, speaking quietly, not quietly enough. The waterfront property alone makes it worth pushing. We just need the paperwork lined up. Once we have the evaluation on record, the rest is straightforward. A pause. Then, she's cooperative. That's the main thing. Ginny stood at the kitchen counter. She didn't move. She heard Warren's footsteps come down the hall, and then stop when he saw her. He smiled. He asked if there was any coffee left. She said yes. She poured him a cup. They talked about the weather, about a restaurant Sylvia wanted to try, about nothing at all. And after he left, Ginny walked to the porch and stood looking out at the bay for a long time. Cooperative, he had called her. Like she was a project. Like she was a property that needed to be managed toward a particular outcome. She thought about Raymond, about the bicycle cable still in his hands, about the last cup of coffee he always saved for her. Then she went inside, opened the kitchen drawer where she kept a small notepad, and she wrote down the date, the time, and exactly what she had heard Warren say. She didn't know yet what she was going to do with it, but she knew, in the way that women who have been patient for a very long time sometimes suddenly and clearly know things, that whatever was happening in her house, in her life, around her without her permission, it was not going to continue without a fight. She told me that standing at that kitchen counter, listening to her son-in-law describe her as cooperative, that was the moment something shifted. Not anger, exactly. Not yet. Something quieter than anger. Something that had been sleeping for a long time and was now, slowly, opening its eyes. She went back to that notepad 3 more times that week, writing things down, dates, conversations. Small things she'd noticed and dismissed and was now looking at differently. Raymond used to say that Ginny was the most patient person he'd ever known. He meant it as a compliment. Ginny told me she'd always thought of it as simply her nature. But patience, she was learning, has a limit. And when it reaches that limit, it doesn't become anger. It becomes something much more useful. It becomes clarity. The next morning, Ginny did something she hadn't done in a long time. She called Sylvia first, not to confront, not to accuse. She called the way a mother calls a daughter, carefully, with love still intact, with the hope that there is a simple explanation for something that doesn't yet have one. She told Sylvia she'd overheard part of Warren's phone conversation the day before. She kept her voice even. She said she wasn't upset. She just wanted to understand what he'd meant. There was a pause on the line. Then Sylvia said, "Mom, Warren's just trying to help. He knows people in real estate. He's just thinking ahead for you. You know how he is. Who was he talking to? Ginny asked. I don't know. Probably someone from work. He mentioned an evaluation, a report. Another pause, shorter this time. Mom, we're just worried about you. That's all this is. Can we talk about this Sunday? Come for dinner. Ginny said yes. She said she'd come for dinner. She said she loved her. She hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then she opened her notepad and wrote down every word of that phone call, too. She went to dinner on Sunday. It was a pleasant evening, on the surface. Sylvia had cooked a roast chicken, green beans, the kind of meal that says everything is fine. We are a normal family having a normal dinner. Warren was at his most charming. He refilled Ginny's water glass without being asked. He asked about her garden, about the neighbors she'd mentioned once in passing, about whether she'd thought any more about taking a trip somewhere, now that she had the time. Ginny ate her dinner. She answered his questions. She complimented Sylvia's cooking, which genuinely good. And she noticed, with the careful attention she had been quietly developing over the past weeks, that Warren and Sylvia exchanged exactly 3 looks during the meal that had nothing to do with her. Small looks. Quick. The kind that carry a conversation in a fraction of a second between 2 people who have agreed on something beforehand. She filed that away too. On the drive home, she thought about what she knew and what she didn't know. She knew Warren had a plan that involved her house and something he called an evaluation. She knew Sylvia had chosen, when asked directly, to redirect rather than answer. She knew a doctor had visited her home, uninvited, and written a report about her cognitive state that she had never been allowed to read. What she didn't know was how far along any of this was. She found out 4 days later. She was in the garden on a Wednesday morning, pulling weeds from the bed along the south fence, the one Raymond had planted with bird of paradise, and never quite gotten right, when her neighbor Nadine Okafor appeared at the fence gate. Nadine had lived next door for 15 years. She was 63, Nigerian-American, recently retired from 30 years of nursing, and possessed of the particular directness that comes from decades of delivering difficult information to people who needed to hear it. She and Ginny had drunk more cups of tea together than either of them could count. She was, Ginny told me, the person she would have called first in any crisis, which made it all the more significant that she hadn't called her yet. I need to show you something, Nadine said. She was holding her phone. It was a listing, a preliminary property assessment, the kind that real estate agents file before a formal listing to establish value and market positioning. The address was Ginny's address. The property was described as waterfront adjacent, high-value lot, significant renovation potential, ideal for luxury redevelopment. The assessment was dated 6 weeks ago. Ginny looked at the phone for a long time. Where did you find this? She asked. One of my cousins works at a title company, Nadine said. She saw the address come across her desk and called me. Ginny, this was filed before Raymond passed. The garden went very quiet. Before Raymond passed, not after. Not in the weeks following the funeral, when a grieving man's ambitious son-in-law had begun to see opportunity in tragedy. Before, 6 weeks before Raymond died, someone had filed a preliminary assessment on the Caldwell property on Old Tampa Bay. Ginny handed the phone back to Nadine. She picked up her trowel. She set it down again. Come inside, she said. I'll make tea. Ruth pauses, long enough to let it land. An assessment filed before Raymond died. Sit with what that means. How long this had been in motion. Who knew what and when. There's one question underneath all of it. The same question Ginny asked herself, sitting in her kitchen across from Nadine that Wednesday morning, hands wrapped around a mug she wasn't drinking from. Did Sylvia know? Inside, over tea, Ginny told Nadine everything. All of it, Warren's early conversations about financial planning, Dr. Gale's visit, the phone call she'd overheard, the Sunday dinner, the 3 exchanged looks. All the small things she'd been writing down in her notepad, individually unremarkable, assembled now into something with a very clear shape. Nadine listened without interrupting. When Ginny finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Ginny, I need you to hear me. What you're describing has a name. It's called elder financial abuse. I've seen it more times than I want to count, from the other side of a hospital bed. And it almost always looks exactly like this. Gradual, reasonable, wrapped in the language of love and concern. Ginny said she'd heard the term. She'd never thought it applied to anyone she knew. That's how it works, Nadine said. She told Ginny about Florida's Adult Protective Services, the hotline 1-800-96-ABUSE. Free, confidential, available 7 days a week. Not just for physical abuse, for financial exploitation, for manipulation, for exactly the kind of slow-moving pressure campaign that had been building around Ginny for months. You don't have to have all the evidence first, Nadine said. You just have to make the call. Ginny looked at her notepad on the kitchen table. I'll make the call, she said. She made it the next morning. Ruth looks at camera. I want to stop here for just a moment, because I know for some of you watching this are in situations that feel familiar right now. Maybe not identical, but familiar in the way that makes your chest tighten a little when you hear certain words. If that's you, please write down this number. Florida Adult Protective Services, 1-800-962-2873. And if you're not in Florida, every state has one. Every single state. You can search Adult Protective Services and your state name, and you will find it. You don't have to be certain. You don't have to have proof. You just have to make the call. Okay, back to Ginny. The APS call took 40 minutes. The woman on the other end was calm and thorough, and did not once make Ginny feel foolish or dramatic. By the end of the call, a caseworker had been assigned and a referral made to a legal aid organization in Pinellas County that specialized in elder law. 3 days later, Ginny sat across a desk from a man named Theodore Winslow. Ted Winslow was 61, semi-retired, and had spent the better part of 3 decades doing elder law in Florida, wills, estates, guardianship disputes, financial exploitation cases. He was unhurried and methodical, and had, Ginny told me, the kind of face that had heard everything and was not going to be surprised by anything she said. She laid out everything. The notepad, the overheard phone call, Dr. Gale's visit, the preliminary property assessment filed 6 weeks before Raymond died, all of it. Ted listened. He asked careful questions. He took notes in a small spiral notebook with a mechanical pencil. When she finished, he said, Mrs. Caldwell, I want to explain something to you about Florida law, because it's going to matter, and because it's going to keep you out of trouble. Florida, he told her, is a 2-party consent state. A private conversation in her home could only be recorded if everyone in it agreed. Doing it secretly, slipping a phone into her cardigan pocket while Warren talked, wasn't just inadmissible. It was a felony, the kind of mistake that could turn the person being wronged into the person who broke the law. So whatever you do, Ted said, don't record him. It would feel satisfying. It would also hand them the one weapon they don't currently have. Ginny nodded slowly. Then what do I do? 2 things. He held up a finger. First, that notepad of yours. Keep it. Every date, every conversation, written down as close to when it happened as you can manage. Contemporaneous notes carry real weight, and they're entirely yours. A second finger. Second, let them do the writing. People building a case against someone almost never notice they're building one against themselves. If Warren wants you to sign anything, tell him you'd like the details in writing first, so you can read them over. Say your memory isn't what it used to be, if you have to. Ginny looked at him for a moment. Then something that was almost a smile crossed her face. Use their own story against them, she said. Their words, in their handwriting, in your possession, Ted said. Nothing I could ever pull off a hidden microphone is worth half as much. He also told her he wanted to arrange an independent cognitive evaluation, a full neurological and psychiatric assessment conducted by specialists with no connection to Warren Pruitt or anyone associated with him. If Dr. Gale's report was going to be used as the foundation of a legal challenge to her competency, They needed to be able to counter it with something unimpeachable. How soon can we do that? Ginny asked. I'll have something scheduled by the end of the week, Ted said. She drove home that afternoon through the kind of late Florida afternoon that turns everything gold. The bay, the road, the tops of the palm trees, all of it washed in that particular end-of-day light that Raymond had loved. She drove carefully, as she always did. She parked in the driveway, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment. Then she went inside and stood in the kitchen for a long time without turning on any lights. It's the hours in between that matter here, not the phone call, not the meeting with Ted. The hours in between, the long, quiet ones when there was nothing to do yet, when the shape of everything had become clear, but the response was still forming. The hours when Ginny was alone with what she now knew. She knew her son-in-law had been planning to take her home before her husband was in the ground. She knew a doctor had written a report about her mental state that she'd never been allowed to see. She knew there were documents with her address on them that she had never signed. And she didn't know, still didn't know, whether her daughter had been part of this from the beginning or whether Sylvia's was another kind of victim. Whether Warren had convinced her this was love, the way people convince themselves that control is protection and theft is care. That not knowing was, Ginny told me, the hardest part. She could be angry at Warren. Anger at Warren was clean and justified and required no grief to accompany it. But Sylvia was her daughter. Sylvia was the child she had driven to swim lessons and sat up with through ear infections and helped move into her first apartment. Sylvia was 41 years of love and memory, and the specific hope that parents carry for their children without ever quite being able to put it down, not knowing whether Sylvia was lost too. That was where the real weight lived. She made herself dinner that night. Nothing complicated. Soup from the freezer, bread from the bread box. She ate at the kitchen table with the small lamp on and the bay dark outside the window. After dinner, she took out her notepad and she wrote at the top of a new page. What I know. I don't know what I'm going to do. She filled 2 pages. Then she went to her bedroom and stood in front of Raymond's side of the closet, which she hadn't touched since September. She didn't open it. She just stood there for a moment with her hand on the door. I'm going to be okay, she said out loud, to the closet, to the room, to whatever remained of 34 years that's in that small particular space. I'm going to be okay. But I need you to know I'm angry. I'm really angry. And I think that's all right. She didn't sleep well that night. She didn't expect to. But in the morning she was up before 6, coffee made, notepad open, phone charged. She had a call scheduled with Ted Winslow at 9. She had things to do. She wrote me something in her letter that I've read more than once since then. She wrote, "The loneliest I have ever felt was not the night Raymond died. It was the night I understood that the people who were supposed to love me had decided my life was a problem to be managed. That loneliness is a different kind. It has no comfort in it. I think about that a lot. The difference between grief and betrayal. Grief has a shape to it, even when it's devastating. Betrayal is shapeless. It moves the walls of every room you've ever felt safe in. But here's what I also know about Ginny Caldwell. She didn't stay in that shapelessness. She didn't let it become her address. She had 2 pages of notes. A lawyer named Ted Winslow, a neighbor named Nadine, and a quiet news strategy she was learning to trust. And the people who had decided she was cooperative, who had looked at a 67-year-old woman living quietly in her house by the water and seen only an obstacle between themselves and what they wanted. Those people had made the most expensive miscalculation of their lives. They had assumed that patience was passivity. They were about to find out otherwise. The independent evaluation took place on a Friday morning at a neurology practice in St. Petersburg. 2 doctors, neither of whom had any professional or personal connection to Warren Pruitt or Dr. Preston Gale. Ted had been careful about that. He was careful about most things. The assessment lasted 3 hours. Memory, language, executive function, spatial reasoning, processing speed. A psychiatric component, a review of her medical history going back 10 years. Ginny sat through all of it with the same steady patience she'd been carrying her whole life, answering every question, completing every task, occasionally noting to herself the irony of spending a Friday morning, proving that she was exactly who she had always been. When it was over, the neurologist, a woman named Dr. Hartley, methodical and precise, told her she would have the written report within the week. Then she paused, looked at Ginny over the top of her glasses, and said, "Mrs. Caldwell, I want you to know what I'm seeing today is not someone who needs monitoring. What I'm seeing is someone who is managing an enormous amount of stress with remarkable composure." Ginny thanked her. She drove home. She made lunch. 3 days later, Ted called. "The evaluation is clean," he said. "Completely clean. No cognitive concerns, no memory issues, no indicators of any kind. Dr. Hartley's report is thorough and unambiguous." "And Dr. Gale's report?" Ginny asked. "That's what I want to talk to you about," Ted said. "I've been looking into Dr. Gale. His primary practice is in Sarasota. Small, private, mostly concierge medicine. I found 3 real estate transactions in the past 4 years in which Warren Pruitt served as the broker. 2 of them involve properties owned by clients of Dr. Gale's practice." Ginny was quiet for a moment. "So they have a financial relationship." "A documented one," Ted said, "which means Dr. Gale's report has a conflict of interest problem that a first-year law student could drive a truck through." "What happens now?" Ginny asked. "Now," Ted said, "we wait for them to make their move. And while we wait, you keep that notepad close, and you let Warren do the writing." She did. Warren came by twice that week. The first time, he wanted to talk about the roof. He'd heard there was a storm system building in the Gulf. He just wanted to make sure everything was in order. Ginny made coffee, let him talk, answered in short sentences. And the moment he left, she sat down at the kitchen table and wrote it all down. The date, the time, the things he'd said and the way he'd said them, while it was still fresh. The second visit was different. He came alone on a Thursday evening, without calling first. Sylvia wasn't with him. He sat down at the kitchen table, the same chair he always took, the one that faced the window, and he put both hands flat on the table and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, something that was trying to be concern, but had slipped, just slightly, into something harder underneath. "Ginny," he said, "I want to be honest with you." She waited. "Sylvia and I are worried, not just about the house, not just about the finances, about you, about what happens to you if something goes wrong. And there's no structure in place. We've been trying to help, but I feel like every time we bring it up, you pull back. And I need you to understand. We're not trying to take anything from you. We're trying to protect you." Ginny looked at him across the table. She kept her hands folded, her face open, her voice mild. "Warren," she said carefully, "what exactly are you proposing?" He leaned forward slightly, a power of attorney. "Limited scope, just financial. You'd still live here, nothing changes day to day. But Sylvia and I would be able to manage the accounts, make sure the bills are paid, handle any property decisions that come up. It's standard. Lots of families do it." "Property decisions," Ginny repeated. "Just maintenance, upkeep. If something needed to be done with the house, repairs, or down the road, if the property ever needed to be restructured, we'd be able to move quickly without tying things up in paperwork." "Restructured," Ginny repeated. "Just maintenance, upkeep. If something needed to be done with the house, repairs, or down the road, if the property ever needed to be restructured, we'd be able to move quickly without tying things up in paperwork." She let a small silence sit. Then she said, in the mildest voice she owned, "You know I don't quite trust myself with details these days, Warren. Would you write all that down for me, the way you just explained it, and email it over? I'd like to read it slowly, once or twice, before I decide anything." Warren's face did something complicated for half a second, and then settled into satisfaction. A woman asking him to put it in writing was a woman halfway to signing. "Of course," he said. "I'll send it tonight." Thank you, Warren. He left 20 minutes later. She walked him to the door, said goodnight, and waited until his headlights had cleared the end of the street. The email came at 9:40 that evening. 2 paragraphs, unhurried and confident, laying out the limited power of attorney, the authority over the accounts, and, in his own typed words, the part about property decisions and how the house could, down the road, be restructured without tying things up in paperwork. Ginny read it twice, the way she'd promised. Then she forwarded it to Ted. Then she forwarded a copy to her own email address, the one she'd never given to Warren or Sylvia, and she printed it, and she slid the printout into the drawer with the notepad. Then she made herself a cup of tea and sat at the table for a while in the quiet, thinking about the word restructured, typed out now, signed with his name, and what it cost a person to read someone explain in writing why your home is an asset to be optimized. She told me about that evening in some detail. She said the thing that stayed with her wasn't anger. It was something more specific. She said, "Ruth, I have sat across from difficult people my whole life. Difficult patients' families, difficult colleagues, difficult situations that took patience and tact. But I have never had to sit across from someone, ask him kindly to put his own scheme in writing, and pretend it was because I couldn't be trusted to remember it. That was the loneliest kind of conversation I have ever had. The loneliness of understanding everything and acting like you understand nothing." She was very good at it. Warren had no idea. 2 weeks after that Thursday evening, Ted called with news. Warren and Sylvia had filed. Not a full guardianship petition. Ted had been watching for that. And what they filed was more targeted. A petition for limited guardianship over Ginny's property and financial assets, citing Dr. Gale's report as the primary medical evidence and 3 supporting declarations. One from a woman who claimed to have observed Ginny leaving her car unlocked overnight, one from a man who said he'd seen her appear disoriented in a parking lot, and one from an unnamed neighbor who said Ginny had mentioned forgetting to pay a utility bill. Ted read through the declarations on the phone while Ginny sat at the kitchen table with a notepad. "The car," she said when he finished. "I left my car unlocked once, in my own driveway, on purpose because Nadine needed to get something from the back seat while I was on the phone." "Write that down," Ted said. "The parking lot, I don't know who that is. I don't recognize the description." "Write that down too. And I have never missed a utility payment in 40 years. I have the bank statements." "Good," Ted said. "Bring them all." The guardianship petition triggered a mandatory mediation process before any contested hearing. The court referred both parties to a formal session with a certified mediator before it would set the matter down for trial. Ted explained this carefully. It was not a trial. There was no jury. It was a structured negotiation, presided over by a neutral third party, aimed at reaching a resolution without full litigation. "What does that mean for us?" Ginny asked. "It means we have one session to lay out everything we have," Ted said, "and what we have is substantial. The conflict of interest on Dr. Gale, the independent evaluation, your notes, Warren's own email, in his own words, the property assessment filed before Raymond passed." There was a pause. "Ted," Ginny said, "the property assessment, does it show who filed it?" A beat of silence. "It shows the brokerage, Warren's firm, but not whether Sylvia knew." "No," he said, "not directly. That question, did Sylvia know, had been living in Ginny like a splinter for months. Some days she was certain Sylvia had been part of it from the beginning. Other days she looked at her daughter's phone calls, her cooked dinners, her genuine seeming worry, and thought, what if Warren convinced her this was real? What if Sylvia believes she's helping? She didn't know. She still didn't know. And she was going to walk into a mediation room and sit across from her daughter without knowing. Nadine came over the evening before the mediation. She brought food. Jerk chicken, rice, the kind of meal that required no decisions, just eating. They sat on the screened porch and watched the bay go dark, and Nadine didn't ask Ginny how she was feeling because she already knew. and that was the particular gift of 15 years of friendship. After a while, Nadine said, "Whatever happens tomorrow, you already know the truth. They can't take that from you." Ginny looked out at the water. "Raymond always said the bay looked different at night," she said, like it was thinking about something. Nadine smiled. "What do you think it's thinking about tonight?" Ginny was quiet for a moment. Then, "I think it's thinking that tomorrow is going to be a long day." Nadine laughed, a real laugh, warm and full, and Ginny laughed too, for the first time in longer than she could remember. Not the polite kind, the real kind. The kind that comes from somewhere deep and honest, and doesn't ask permission. She slept better that night than she had in months. In the morning, she got up early. She made coffee. She put on the navy blue dress she'd worn to Raymond's retirement dinner 12 years ago, because it was the dress she felt most like herself in. She checked her notepad one last time, not because she needed to, but because the act of checking it had become over these months a ritual of its own, evidence that she was still here, still paying attention, still the same person she had always been, just more awake to certain things than she used to be. She drove herself to the mediation office in Clearwater. She parked carefully. She walked in. Ted was already there, waiting in the lobby with 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one without being asked. "Ready?" he said. "No," she said. "Let's go anyway." She told me that on the drive over, she'd thought about Raymond. Not in a sad way, or not only in a sad way. She'd thought about something he used to say when he was facing a problem at work, some complicated engineering question with no obvious solution. "The answer is already there. You just have to be patient enough to let it show itself." She'd always thought he was talking about engineering. She understood now that he was talking about everything. The mediation room was smaller than Ginny had expected. A rectangular table, 6 chairs, a window that looked out onto a parking lot, a pitcher of water, and a box of tissues on a side table. The tissues, Ginny noted, suggesting that whoever set up these rooms understood what usually happened in them. Warren and Sylvia's were already seated when Ginny and Ted came in. Warren was in a dark suit, a tie she hadn't seen before, the careful presentation of a man who understood that appearance was a form of argument. Sylvia was in gray, a blazer, her hair pulled back, and she looked, Ginny thought, like she hadn't slept well. There were shadows under her eyes that makeup hadn't entirely covered. Their attorney was a woman named Diane Forsyth, mid-50s, composed, the kind of lawyer who made her points quietly and let the silence do the rest of the work. She nodded at Ted when they entered. Ted nodded back. The mediator was Judge Carol Whitmore, retired, now certified in civil mediation, with the particular authority of someone who had heard 10,000 arguments and was not going to be impressed by any of them. She was 68, silver-haired, and had the kind of stillness that fills a room without effort. She welcomed everyone, explained the process, reminded all parties that mediation was confidential and that her role was facilitation, not adjudication. Then she turned to Diane Forsyth and said, "Petitioners, you may begin." Diane was precise and measured. She presented the guardianship petition as an act of familial concern, a daughter and son-in-law watching a recently widowed mother show signs of cognitive vulnerability, taking the responsible step of seeking legal structure to protect her. She cited Dr. Gale's report. She read portions of the 3 supporting declarations. She used words like proactive and preventive and loving. Ginny listened without expression. Under the table, her hands were folded in her lap, completely still. When Diane finished, Judge Whitmore turned to Ted. Ted opened his folder. He began with the independent evaluation. Dr. Hartley's report, full neurological and psychiatric workup. Results completely normal, no indicators of cognitive decline of any kind. He placed a copy in front of Judge Whitmore and a copy in front of Diane Forsyth, who read the first page with an expression that shifted, slightly and quickly, into something less certain than it had been. Then he moved to Dr. Gale. He laid out the financial relationship between Gale and Pruitt, the 3 real estate transactions, the brokerage records, the documented pattern of professional association. He used the phrase conflict of interest exactly once, and then he let the document speak. Diane Forsythe started to respond. Judge Whitmore held up one hand, just slightly, and Diane stopped. Continue, the judge said to Ted. Ted set a printed email on the table. This, he said, is an email sent by Warren Pruitt to Mrs. Caldwell at her request, on the evening of the date noted at the top. In it, Mr. Pruitt proposes a financial power of attorney and describes, in his own words, how the property could, and I quote him directly, be restructured without, again his words, teeing things up in paperwork. He let that sit for a moment. Then he placed the preliminary property assessment beside it. And this, he said, is a preliminary listings assessment for the Caldwell property at. He read the address, filed with Warren Pruitt's brokerage. The date of filing is 6 weeks prior to the death of Raymond Caldwell. The room went quiet. Not the polite quiet of people being attentive. The different kind, the kind that happens when something lands that cannot be unlanded. Warren's expression didn't change, exactly, but something behind it moved. Something that had been braced for a particular kind of conversation was now recalibrating. Sylvia looked at the documents. Then she looked at Warren. She looked at him for a long moment. He didn't look back. Messrs. Pruitt, Judge Whitmore said quietly, "Are you familiar with this assessment?" Sylvia's voice, when it came, was careful. Warren handled the real estate side of things. I wasn't involved in, Sylvia. Warren's voice, low a warning note. She stopped. She looked at him again. Something passed across her face. Not surprise, exactly, because this was not the face of someone encountering new information. This was the face of someone who had been holding something for a long time and was suddenly in this with a pitcher of water and a box of tissues, feeling the weight of it differently than she had before. Ted set his folder down and looked at Ginny. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, "would you like to speak?" Ginny had not planned to speak. It was not the plan. The plan was Ted, the documents, Warren's email, if it came to that. But she looked at the table, at the assessment filed before Raymond died, at the email in Warren's own words, at Dr. Hartley's report, at her own notepad, which Ted had allowed her to bring as a reference. And then she looked at her daughter. Sylvia was looking back at her. Her eyes were full, though she hadn't cried yet. She looked, in that moment, more like the child Ginny remembered than the woman who had sat at Sunday dinner exchanging careful looks with her husband. She looked young and scared and tired. Ginny looked at her for a long moment. Then she turned to Judge Whitmore. "Yes," she said, "I would." She did not look at her notes. She didn't need them. "I am 67 years old," she said. "I have managed my own finances, my own health, my own household for 40 years. I buried my husband 4 months ago, and I have done that alone, with patience and without asking anyone for more than they were willing to give. I am not confused. I am not fragile. I am not a property to be managed." She paused. "I understand that families sometimes disagree about the best way to care for people they love. I understand that grief does strange things to people, and that fear sometimes looks like control. But what is in front of us today is not care. What is in front of us today is a document filed while my husband was still alive, and an email from a man who came to my home and asked me to sign away my house as if I were a transaction." She placed her hands flat on the table. "I would like my life back. I would like my home to be my home again. And I would like my daughter." Her voice, here, caught just slightly, the first and only time, "to have made better choices than the ones that brought us to this room." The silence that followed was the longest kind. Then Warren's attorney leaned over and said something quietly to him. Warren's jaw tightened. He looked at the table. And then Sylvia Pruitt did something that no one in that room, not Ted, not Judge Whitmore, not Diane Forsythe, and not Ginny herself, had expected. She pushed her chair back from the table slightly, not standing, not leaving, just creating a small physical distance from the man sitting next to her. An inch, maybe 2. Then she said, to no one in particular and to everyone, The assessment was Warren's idea. I didn't know about it until after Dad died. He told me it was just preliminary research, just thinking ahead. I didn't ask enough questions. I should have asked more questions. Warren turned to look at her. She didn't look back at him. I thought we were helping, she said. Her voice was steady, but only barely. I really did think that. I don't know when I stopped asking whether we were actually helping or just telling ourselves that. The box of tissues on the side table remained where it was. Sylvia didn't reach for it. She sat very still with her hands in her lap, looking at something in the middle distance that wasn't quite the table and wasn't quite her mother. Judge Whitmore let the silence stand for a moment. Then she said, in a measured tone that carried no particular emotion, "I think we should take a brief recess." Ginny told me that during the recess, she stood in the hallway outside the mediation room and looked out a window at the parking lot below. Ted stood nearby, giving her space. She didn't cry. She wasn't sure what she felt. Exactly. It was too large and too mixed to have a single name. There was something like relief, but it was complicated by grief. There was something like vindication, but it was complicated by the fact that the person who had just told the truth was still her daughter, still the child she had raised, still the person she loved in the stubborn way that parents love their children, long past the point where the love makes any rational sense. She thought about Raymond. She thought, "I wish you were here. And I'm glad you're not." The recess lasted 12 minutes. When they reconvened, Warren's attorney requested a private session with her client. 20 minutes later, she came back with a proposal. The guardianship petition would be withdrawn. In full. Warren's brokerage would formally relinquish any interest in the Caldwell property. Dr. Gale's report would be stricken from any further proceedings. In exchange, Ginny would not pursue civil litigation for the costs she had incurred. Ted's fees, the evaluation costs, the months of documented stress. Ted looked at Ginny. Ginny thought about it for exactly as long as she needed to. "One more thing," she said. Diane Forsythe waited. "Dr. Gale's conduct gets reported to the Florida Medical Board. That's not negotiable. That goes through regardless of what we agree to here." There was a pause. Warren's attorney consulted with him in a low voice, then agreed. Ginny nodded. "Then we're done," she said. They signed the agreement 40 minutes later. Warren left without making eye contact with anyone. His attorney followed. Sylvia remained. She sat at the table after everyone else had cleared out. The mediator, the attorneys, even Ted, who stepped into the hallway to give them a moment. And Ginny sat across from her daughter in the small room with the pitcher of water and the unused tissues, and they looked at each other. "I don't know what to say," Sylvia said. "I know," Ginny said. "Mom, not today, Sylvia." Ginny's voice was not unkind, it was simply honest. "Not today. There's too much, and I'm too tired, and I think we both need some time before we try to talk about what comes next." Sylvia nodded. Her eyes were wet, but she didn't cry. She was her mother's daughter in that much, at least. At the door, she stopped and turned back. "The house," she said. "I'm glad you kept it." Ginny looked at her for a moment. "So am I," she said. Sylvia left. Ginny stood in the empty room for a moment, alone with the afternoon light coming through the window that looked out onto the parking lot, and thought about what it costs to fight for something that should never have required fighting for. The months of notes, the evenings alone, the long, quiet hours of being patient and careful, and exactly who she had always been while the people around her decided she was something less. Then she picked up her bag, her notepad, and the folder of documents she'd brought and used. She walked out into the hallway where Ted was waiting. "It's done," she said. He nodded. "It's done." She drove home through the late afternoon. She took the long way, the road that runs along the water, the one Raymond had loved because you could see the bay all the way from the causeway to the marina. The light was the same gold it had been on the day she'd met with Ted for the first time, but it felt different now. Lighter, somehow, as if the quality of gold itself had changed. She pulled into the driveway of the house on Old Tampa Bay, Her house, on the water, with Raymond's garden still growing imperfectly along the south fence. And she sat in the car for a moment before going inside. Then she went in and made herself a cup of coffee, the same way Raymond always had. Measured, precise. She left the last cup for no one. But she thought about him while she drank it. When Ginny told me about that drive home, she said something that has stayed with me. She said, I didn't feel like I'd won something. I felt like I'd gotten back something that was always mine. And those are two very different feelings. They are. They really are. The weeks after the mediation were quieter than Ginny expected. Not peaceful, exactly. Quiet in the way that follows something large. The particular stillness of a house after a storm has passed through, when the air is different and everything is slightly rearranged and you walk through the rooms taking stock of what remains. What remained in Ginny's case was the house, the garden, the screened porch facing the water, the kitchen table where Raymond had drunk his coffee for 31 years, the notepad in the drawer, full now, that she didn't throw away because it had become, in some way she couldn't entirely explain, a record of who she was when it mattered most to know. Ted filed the report on Dr. Gale with the Florida Medical Board the week after the mediation, as agreed. The board's review process, he explained, would take time, months, possibly longer. These things rarely moved quickly. But the report was filed, the record existed, and whatever came of it would come without Ginny having to do anything more. Warren's brokerage sent a formal letter relinquishing any claim to or interest in the Caldwell property. Ted reviewed it, confirmed it was complete, and filed it. Ginny read it once, folded it, and put it in a drawer. She didn't hear from Warren after that. She didn't expect to. Sylvia she heard from once, about 3 weeks after the mediation. A text message, brief and careful. Mom, I hope you're okay. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know I'm thinking about you. Ginny read it several times. Then she put her phone down and went out to work in the garden and thought about it while she pulled weeds from Raymond's bird of paradise bed, which was finally, as of his patient attention in several months of hers, beginning to look the way he'd always meant it to. She didn't reply that day, or the next. On the third day, she picked up her phone and typed, I'm okay, give it some time. She sent it before she could revise it. Sylvia replied with a single word. Okay. That was enough, for now. Maybe it was the beginning of something. Maybe it wasn't. Ginny had learned, over these months, not to rush toward conclusions she couldn't yet see clearly. I want to tell you something about this part of the story, because I think it's the part that gets left out most often when people tell stories like Ginny's. We like the resolution. We like the moment when justice arrives, and the bad actors face consequences and the person who was wronged gets back what was taken. And those things matter. They genuinely matter. But what comes after is harder and stranger and less satisfying. And I think it's important to say so. Because after the mediation, Ginny still had to live in the house where the betrayal had happened. She still had to drive past the road that led to Sylvia's neighborhood. She still had to figure out, day by day, what her relationship with her daughter was now, and whether it could become something different, and how long that would take, and whether she had the patience for it. She told me. People kept asking if I felt better, and I didn't know how to answer that. Better than what? Better than the worst of it? Yes. Better than before any of it happened? I don't think you get back to before. I think you just find a different after. A different after. I've thought about that phrase a great deal since she said it. 6 months after the mediation, Nadine called Ginny on a Sunday afternoon. Come for a walk, she said. The light's good. They walked along the waterfront path that runs behind their street, the one that follows the edge of the bay for about a mile before turning back toward the neighborhood. It was November, which in Clearwater means the air has finally remembered it isn't summer. Cooler, drier, the kind of afternoon that feels like a gift after months of heat. They walked slowly, the way people walk when they're not going anywhere in particular and don't need to. After a while, Nadine said, My cousin at the title company called me last week. Ginny waited. She said Warren's brokerage lost 2 major listings this fall. Word got around, apparently. People talk. Ginny was quiet for a moment. The bay was very still, reflecting the late afternoon sky. I don't feel happy about that, she said. I thought I would. But I don't. Nadine nodded. No, she said. I don't think you were ever in it for that. What was I in it for? Nadine looked at her. To stay, she said simply. To keep being exactly who you are, in your own home, on your own terms. That's all you ever wanted. Ginny thought about that. Raymond would have hated all of this, she said. He hated conflict. He would have wanted to find a compromise, talk it through, make everyone comfortable. And what do you think he'd say now? Nadine asked. Ginny smiled, small and real. I think he'd say I was right. And then he'd make coffee and change the subject. Nadine laughed. Ginny laughed with her. And they kept walking along the water. In the November afternoon light, 2 women in their 60s who had known each other long enough to walk in silence and call it company. 8 months after the mediation, Sylvia called. Not a text this time. A call on a Tuesday evening while Ginny was on the porch watching the bay. She almost didn't answer. Her thumb hovered over the green button for a long moment, weighing things she couldn't quite name. Then she pressed it. Hi, Mom. Hi, Sylvia. A pause. The kind that has weight in it. I've been seeing someone, Sylvia said, a therapist. For about 4 months now. I'm glad, Ginny said, and she was, simply, without complication. She keeps asking me to think about what I actually believed back then. Whether I really thought I was helping you, or whether I just needed to believe that. Another pause. I don't have a clean answer yet. That sounds about right, Ginny said. Mom, you don't have to. I want to. I need to say it properly, not just I need to say I'm sorry for what we did, for how long it went on, for not asking enough questions, the way I said in that room. I'm sorry. Ginny looked out at the bay. The water was dark, moving slightly, the way it always did in the evening. She thought about what forgiveness meant. Not the easy kind, the kind that resolves things neatly and puts them away and lets everyone feel better. The harder kind, the kind that doesn't require forgetting, doesn't erase what happened, doesn't pretend the months of notes and sleepless nights and standing at Raymond's closet door were something other than what they were. This kind that says, I see what you did. I understand what it cost both of us. And I'm choosing, slowly and without any guarantees, to leave a door open. I hear you, Sylvia, she said finally. I'm not all the way there yet, but I hear you. That's enough, Sylvia said. That's more than enough. They talked for another 20 minutes. About small things, mostly. Sylvia's job, a book she'd read, a restaurant in Dunedin she thought Ginny might like. Normal things. The kind of conversation that doesn't carry the weight of everything that came before it, or carries it lightly, the way people carry things they've decided not to put down, but have learned to hold differently. After they hung up, Ginny sat on the porch for a long time. She didn't feel resolved. She didn't feel healed, or fixed, or arrived at any particular destination. She felt like Watson sitting on a screened porch in Clearwater, Florida, watching the bay go dark, missing her husband, uncertain if it's at her daughter, grateful for her neighbor, and still, in her own house, on her own terms, exactly who she had always been. She thought that was probably enough. She ended her letter with something I want to read to you. Because it's hers, and it deserves to be said in her words, or as close to her words as I can give you, she wrote. I used to think that getting older meant getting smaller, that the world would slowly contract around you until there wasn't much left. I think I believed that without knowing I believed it. And then someone tried to make it true, and I had to decide whether to let them. I'm glad I didn't, not because I won anything, but because I remembered in the fighting that I was still here, that I still had a life that was mine to live. I think that's what Raymond would have wanted me to know. I think that's what he was trying to tell me all those mornings. Leaving the last cup of coffee for me, Ginny is 68 now. She still lives in the house on Old Tampa Bay. Raymond's garden is doing better than it ever did when he was alive, which she says he would have found both gratifying and slightly annoying. She and Nadine walk the waterfront path on Sunday afternoons when the weather is good. She and Sylvia talk on the phone about once a week. Careful conversations, slowly becoming less careful. The door is open. What walks through it and when remains to be seen. Dr. Gale's case with the Florida Medical Board is still under review. These things take time. Warren, as far as Ginny knows, is no longer in her life. She wishes him nothing in particular. And Ted Winslow, she told me, sends a card every Christmas. Just a card. Nothing else. She keeps them in the same drawer as the notepad. I want to say a few things directly to you before we close today, because this story isn't just Ginny's. Elder financial abuse is the fastest growing form of elder abuse in the United States. Studies suggest that 1 in 10 older adults experiences some form of financial exploitation, and the majority of cases are never reported, because the person doing the exploiting is almost always someone the victim loves and trusted. It doesn't always look like what happened to Ginny. Sometimes it's subtler. Sometimes it's a slow erosion of financial control that happens over years. Sometimes it's a single document signed under pressure. Sometimes it starts with questions that seem reasonable and ends somewhere no one intended. If something in Ginny's story felt familiar, if you recognized something in the gradual buildup, the language of concern wrapped around something else, the feeling of being managed rather than cared for, please don't wait as long as Ginny did to make the call. Florida, 1-800-962-2873. Available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Every other state has a number. You can find it by searching Adult Protective Services and your state name. The call is free. It is confidential. You do not need to have proof. You just need to make it. And if you're not in a situation like Ginny's, if you're watching this because you care about someone who might be, you can make that call too, on behalf of someone else. APS will take it from there. I get letters every week from people who are carrying things they don't know what to do with. And I read every one of them, even when it takes me 3 days to get to the end. Ginny's letter took me 3 days, but I'm glad I kept reading. I'm glad she wrote it. And I'm glad you stayed with me through it today, because stories like hers deserve witnesses. They deserve to be heard by people who understand what they cost and what they mean, and why it matters that the person who lived them is still here to tell them. Ginny Caldwell is still here, in her house, by the water, on her own terms. I think that's the whole story, and I think that's enough. Ruth picks up her coffee cup, takes a sip, looks out the window for a moment. Take care of yourselves, friends. I'll see you next time.